We don't usually tell stories about people who have nothing. Not because those stories are rare. They aren't, but because they're harder to sit with. They ask something of you. They ask you to imagine the specific weight of a rucksack on a cold morning when the only thing in it is what someone else decided you were worth. Hazel Fen was 21 years old when her uncle, Reginald Voss, put her things on the portive farmhouse in Huron County, Ontario, in a flour sack that had been rinsed and reused so many times the printed letters had faded to shadows. Her entire life fit inside it. A change of clothes, a tin of salve for cracked hands, a folded letter she'd never finished writing to her father, who had been dead 4 years and could not read it anyway. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tied with a length of cotton twine, a drawknife with a handle of dark-stained maple, worn so smooth along the grip that her fingers knew exactly where to settle the moment she picked it up. That drawknife had belonged to Inge Solberg, who was a cooper by trade, and the only person in Hazel's life who had ever taught her something worth knowing. We'll come back to Inge. We always have to come back to the people who shaped us before we can understand the ones they shaped. But first, the flour sack on the porch, and the note tucked into the knot of the drawstring, written in Reginald Voss's hand, which was the hand of a man who had once kept careful accounts and now kept on grudges. It read, "You've had 4 years of room and board under my roof, which is 4 years more than your father's debts entitled you to. I consider the obligation discharged. There is a bus that passes the county road on Tuesdays and Fridays. I suggest you be on one of them. R. Voss." There was no money enclosed. There hadn't been, Hazel supposed, because Reginald had never thought of her as someone who would need money. He had thought of her as someone who would need to be managed, and those are different problems entirely. She had $19 and some change in the pocket of her coat. Money she had earned herself over 3 summers doing piecework for a furniture maker in Cooperage, who didn't ask questions about her age and paid in cash on Fridays. She had hidden it in the lining of her left boot because she had understood, in the way that people who are not valued learn to understand things early, that anything she had which could be taken from her would eventually be taken. She stood on the porch for a moment in the October cold and looked at the farm. The gray clapboard siding of the house. The red of the barn gone to rust and salmon. The sugar maple at the corner of the fence line that her father had told her, once, he had planted the year she was born. It was the tallest tree on the property now. She had climbed it every summer as a child, and from the top of it you could see the gray line of Lake Huron, on clear days, flat and enormous and indifferent, in the way that very large bodies of water tend to be. She picked up the flour sack, settled it over her shoulder, walked down the porch steps without looking back, not because she wasn't afraid, but because looking back wouldn't change what was behind her. Let us tell you a little about Hazel Fen before she became the woman who spent $19 on a collapsed Cooperage at the end of a logging road in Grey County and found inside it something nobody had expected to find. She was born in 1901 in the town of Wingham, Ontario, the only child of a man named Arvid Fen, who was a millwright by training and a reader by disposition, and a woman named Cecile, who had died of a fever when Hazel was 7 and who lived on in Hazel's memory primarily as a smell. Cedar soap and the particular sweetness of dried lavender hung in bundles from the kitchen rafters. Arvid Fen was a good millwright and an even better father, and the 2 years after Cecile died were not easy, but they were not cold, because Arvid made a point of warmth in the way that some people make a point of thrift. He cooked badly but enthusiastically. He read aloud to her every evening, novels, almanacs, seed catalogs, whatever he had, in a voice that made even a list of winter wheat varieties sound like something worth attending to. He taught her to sharpen a blade and to read a level and to drive a nail without splitting the wood. And he did not treat these as unusual things to teach a daughter, because to him they were simply things worth knowing, and she was the person he had to teach them to. When she was 15, he was killed in an accident at the mill in Blythe. A gear casing failed. He was gone before anyone reached him, and Hazel was sent to live with Reginald Voss in Huron County, who was her father's brother-in-law, and who had agreed to take her in with the particular reluctance of a man accepting a stray that he intended to keep in the yard rather than the house. Reginald was not violent. She wanted to be accurate about that. He was something harder to name, and in some ways harder to survive. A man who believed that usefulness was the only legitimate basis for a relationship, and who recalibrated your value in his household on an ongoing basis against the cost of feeding you. She cooked and cleaned and helped his wife, Margaret Voss, with the mending and the garden and the canning and the 2 younger cousins, who were loud and needed things constantly. She did all of this without complaint, because she had nowhere else to go, and she understood the arithmetic of her situation clearly. The one grace of those 4 years was Inge Solberg. Inge Solberg was 63 years old and had operated a cooperage on the road between Voss's farm and the nearest town for 30-some years, making barrels and buckets and churns and tubs for the farms and the creameries and the cold storage operations that ran across that part of Grey Bruce country. She had learned the trade from her father in Norway and brought it with her when she came to Canada at 20, and she had practiced it alone for most of her working life. Because the 2 apprentices she had taken on over the years had each left for steadier work within 18 months, and after the second one, she had stopped trying. Hazel had found her by accident, walking back from the post office on a Thursday afternoon in her first autumn at the Voss farm. She had smelled the shavings before she saw the shop, a smell of fresh-cut white oak that was sweet and clean, and nothing like anything in Reginald's house. And she had stopped and looked through the open door and watched Inge draw a stave blank down to shape with a long-handled drawknife, curling thin ribbons of wood away from the surface in one smooth pull, the way a cook peels an apple. Hazel had stood in the door for too long without saying anything, and Inge had looked up and said, in a voice that was neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, only flat with competence, "You want to watch or you want to try?" She said she wanted to try. Inge handed her the drawknife and showed her how to set the blank in the shaving horse, and how to draw the tool toward herself with both hands, elbows in, shoulders back, letting the cutting edge do the work rather than fighting the wood. Hazel made a mess of the first 3 attempts, and the 4th one was passable, and on the 5th one something clicked into place in her hands and in her understanding, and she produced a shaving that curled up off the blade in a continuous ribbon the length of the blank. And Inge, who was watching over her shoulder, said, "There, you felt that?" She had felt it. She came back every Thursday after that, and then Saturdays, and then whenever she could slip away from the Voss farm, without Reginald noticing her absence, which was most of the time, because Reginald was not a man who paid close attention to things he wasn't billing. Inge taught her everything: how to read the grain of the wood and choose where to start the cut, how to build a barrel from individual staves that had to be curved in 2 planes simultaneously and fit together so precisely that no coopering ring could stop them from holding water, how to raise and joint and fire bend and true a barrel, how to work a drawknife and a jointer and a croze and a bick iron, how to choose white oak for liquid barrels and pine for dry goods and ash for anything that needed flex, how to find the work in a piece of wood that was already there, waiting, the way you find a path through deep snow, not by forcing it, but by reading the lay of the land and understanding where it wanted to go. Inge was widowed, had been widowed for 20 years, and lived alone above the shop in 2 rooms that smelled of shavings and wood smoke and the strong black tea she drank constantly from a tin cup with a bent handle. She talked while she worked, in the way of people who have been alone long enough that thinking aloud no longer feels like an eccentricity. She told Hazel about the cooperages she had known in her father's time in Stavanger, where the trade was older than the city. She told her about the physics of a barrel. How the shape that looked decorative was actually structural, the bilge curve distributing pressure evenly, the crows holding the head without glue or fasteners. She told her that wood was honest, that it would tell you everything you needed to know about itself if you took the trouble to listen, and that most of what she had learned about people she had learned first from wood. Inge died in the spring of Hazel's 19th year, a Tuesday in April, sitting in her shavings at the end of the workday with drawknife in her lap, and her chin dropped to her chest and her eyes closed, as though she had simply decided to rest, and then rested beyond returning. The county buried her. She left no will that anyone found, and the cooperage was absorbed into the estate of a second cousin in Sault Ste. Marie, who had never met her, and who sold everything at auction by August. Hazel bought the drawknife at that auction for 35 cents, which was everything in her pocket that day. She outbid a man who wanted it for prying fence posts, and who was annoyed by her persistence. She wrapped it in oilcloth and put it in the bottom of her winter coat, and she carried it back to the Voss farm, and she kept it there for 2 years, through 2 more winters of Reginald's careful accounting, until the Tuesday in October, when she found herself standing on the porch, when she found herself with a flour sack over her shoulder, and her entire life accounted for, and found insufficient. The bus that passed the county road on Tuesdays and Fridays went north. Hazel took the Tuesday one because Tuesday was the day she was told about, and because she had no reason to go any direction in particular, only away. She sat in the back with her flour sack on her lap and the window cold against her shoulder and watched Huron County pass behind her. The flat black fields, the bare-limbed elms, the white frame houses set back from the road behind their cedar hedges. And she felt something she would later recognize as relief, though at the time she had no name for it. Only the sensation of a weight being lifted from a place she hadn't known was carrying one. The bus stopped at Owen Sound, and she got off because she was hungry, and because Owen Sound was a real town with a real harbor, and the smell of something cooking from a diner near the bus stop. She ate a bowl of pea soup and a heel of bread for 15 cents and asked the woman behind the counter whether she knew of any work in the area for someone who could do cooperage or woodworking or general repair. The woman, her name was Bet Harwick, who ran the diner with her husband Lou, looked at Hazel over the counter with the particular attention of a woman who had seen a lot of young people come through her door and developed accurate opinions about which ones were capable and which ones were performing capability. "There's nothing here in town," she said, "but there's a man named Silas Croft who buys and sells property up on the Bruce Peninsula, and he's always got something falling down somewhere that needs shoring up. He comes in here on Thursdays. I could put a word in if you want to stay." Hazel said she would stay. She slept that night in the shed behind the diner, on a folded tarpaulin over the bare floor, and she lay awake in the cold and the dark and thought about Inge Solberg, drawing a barrel stave to shape in the low November light of the Cooperage. That clean smell of white oak, the voice saying, "There, you felt that?" She stayed 2 nights. Silas Croft came in on Thursday as promised. He was a small, careful man of about 60 with good boots and a bad cough, and the habit of looking slightly to the left of whomever he was speaking to, as though checking his peripheral vision for something he didn't trust yet. He listened to Hazel describe what she could do with his hands folded over his coffee cup. "I've got a cooperage up in Fernley Township," he said, "north of Colpoys Bay, back on a logging road. Been empty since the fellow who ran it passed in 1915. I've been trying to shift it for years, haven't found a buyer. Building's mostly standing but the roof's in bad shape and there's nobody for miles who'd want it." He paused. "I'd sell it for what I paid in back taxes to be rid of the paperwork. How much is that?" He named a figure. $19. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the folded bills there. The money she had hidden in her boot, and then sewn into the lining of her winter coat, and then moved again into her pocket. The morning she left the Voss farm. She had counted it 6 times since leaving Huron County. She knew exactly what was there. She said, "I'll take it." The Cooperage was 4 miles north of the nearest settlement up a logging road that was more suggestion than road. In October, the ruts filled with leaf fall and the surface gone to mud at the low points where the creek drainage crossed. Silas Croft drove her up in his truck the following Monday, not speaking much, letting the road require his attention. The birches on either side had gone yellow and were beginning to drop, and the light came through them horizontal and honey-colored in the way it does in Ontario. In late October, the light that is beautiful because you know it's almost over. The Cooperage sat in a clearing about an acre wide at the end of the road. It was not what she expected, though she was not sure what she had expected. A single long building, timber-framed, with a stone foundation that had heaved slightly at the northeast corner where the frost had found a weakness. The walls were vertical-cut pine boards, weathered silver. The roof was cedar shake, and the north-facing slope had collapsed inward at some point, letting several years of weather into the interior. The floor was bare earth, packed hard. There was no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters, 2 of which had come loose from their hardware and lay on the ground below their openings. But the frame was sound. She walked the perimeter the way Hazel Fen had taught her to look at a structure, hand against the sill plates, eye along the line of the wall posts, weight on the corners, checking for the kinds of failure that showed themselves slowly, in angles and sags, and the particular way a wall leans when its foundation has moved without the frame knowing it yet. The timber posts were 8x8 white oak, hand-hewn, and they had not moved. The mortise and tenon joints where the posts met the plates were still tight. The sill logs were white cedar, which resists rot better than anything else you can set into the ground, and they were intact. The south end of the building, the dry end, had been the working space. She could tell by the marks on the floor. The shadow outline of a shaving horse in the pale earthy, the circular impression where a barrel had been trued on a floor post, the pattern of shavings packed into the soil so deeply that they'd become part of it. There was a stone hearth in the south wall, with a bellows bracket still bolted to the stonework, though the bellows was long gone. Iron hooks along the wall where the tools had hung, most of them empty, but not all. A drawknife she recognized as a Cooper's pattern blade, narrower than Ingie's, was rusted to one hook but intact. A crow's cutter, a flagging iron, a bung borer with a cracked handle. Tools left behind by someone who had intended to come back, or by someone who hadn't intended anything at all. At the north end of the building, behind a board partition that was still standing despite the roof failure above it, there was a small room that had served as an office or a storeroom. It was dark, the window shutter latched from inside. When she opened it, the light came in gray and thin and showed her a wooden desk, a plank on two sawbucks, really, and a three-legged stool, and a shelf of empty jars, and on the floor in the corner, behind the desk, a steel box about the size of a shoebox, painted black, with a hasp and a padlock that had rusted entirely shut. She left it there. She had a building to evaluate before the light went. Silas Croft waited by his truck and smoked and did not offer opinions. When she came back to him, she said the bones were good, and the foundation was mostly sound, and the roof could be repaired from the south side first. She said she would need tools and materials and a way to get them out the logging road, and she said she would like to know if there were any people nearby who might need the kind of work she could do. He looked at her with the sideways careful look. There's a mill settlement called Barrow's Landing about 6 miles east along the Bay Road. There's a chandler there, and a general trader named Oswald Pete, and a handful of farms. They'll know you're here before you finish the sentence, because it's that kind of place. She took out her $19 and put them in his hand. He wrote the transfer on a piece of paper from the glove box of his truck, and she signed it, and the Cooperage was hers. He drove away. She stood in the clearing with the flour sack over her shoulder, and the October wind moving through the birches and shaking down the last of the yellow leaves in slow spirals, and she listened to the silence the truck left behind, which was not really silence at all, but the creak noise and the wind noise and the far-off call of something in the trees line she couldn't identify, and she thought, this is mine. Not given, not permitted, not loaned out at a rate of interest that could be called in at any time. Bought with the money she had earned herself, in the only years she'd had to earn it. She went inside and started clearing the debris from the south end. She worked until the light was gone. She found the steel box on her 4th day. Not because she had forgotten it, she hadn't, but because there was more urgent work and she had learned from both her father and from Inge to do urgent work before interesting work, always. The roof came first, then the windows, then the door. By the 4th day she had the south half of the roof stripped down to the purlins, which were sound, and had covered the opening with a canvas tarpaulin she had bought from Oswald Pete's trading post in Barrow's Landing, along with a sack of oats, a tin of coffee, a box of candles, and a ball-peen hammer. Oswald Pete was a compact, watchful man of about 50 who kept his accounts in a ledger the size of a flagstone and wrote in pencil, which he kept behind his right ear, and who had asked her exactly 2 questions when she appeared in his store. What do you need, and how do you plan to pay? She had answered both, and he had nodded and gotten her things without ceremony, and said she could run a small account if she needed to, and that he expected prompt payment and didn't mind people who lived on logging roads as long as they weren't trouble. She said she wasn't trouble. Nobody who is trouble ever says otherwise, he said, which was fair. On the 4th day, she went to the North End office in the late afternoon, when the light was still good, through the now open window, and she looked at the black steel box. It was about 10 inches long and 6 wide and 4 deep, with a hasp and a padlock. The padlock was rusted completely through, not just stiff, but oxidized so thoroughly that when she applied pressure with a pry bar she had found on the wall, it crumbled at the shackle. Inside the box was not what she expected, though again she was not certain what she had expected. Coins, maybe. Documents. Something practical. There were 3 things. The first was a roll of papers bound with a dried length of leather cord. When she unrolled them carefully on the desktop, they turned out to be technical drawings. Elevations and detailed drawings of barrel-making jigs and a specialized tightening apparatus she had not seen before, but understood immediately from the geometry. The drawings were precise and annotated in a small, dense hand in English, and what she believed might be Finnish, alternating. The work of someone who thought in 2 languages and drew in one. The second thing was a small canvas pouch, closed with a drawstring. Inside it were 22 silver dollars. American Liberty coins, mostly from the 1890s, with the weight and density of money that has been saved in 1s and 2s over many years rather than accumulated in any single transaction. She counted them once and then again. $22, which was more than she had spent on the property itself. The third thing was a letter, single sheet, folded in half, written on the inside in the same small hand as the drawings. It was dated the 14th of September, 1914. She carried it to the window and read it in the last of the afternoon light. My name is Eva Mickey, and I have run this cooperage since my husband Pavo and I came here from Oulu in 1889. Pavo died in 1909. I have run it alone since then, which is not a thing I would recommend to anyone who has a choice in the matter, and which I would recommend without hesitation to anyone who does not, because running a thing alone teaches you everything about it that comfort and partnership might allow you to overlook. I am writing this in September of 1914. I am 61 years old, and my hands have begun to hurt in the way that Cooper's hands hurt when the years catch up to them, and I have decided to go to my sister in Thunder Bay before another winter. I don't know if I will come back. I am not certain I have the right kind of hope for that anymore. I am leaving the drawings because they took me 30 years to work out, and I will not see them wasted in a fire or a flood or a sale to someone who doesn't know what they are. The jig on the third sheet is the one I am most proud of. I have never seen it in any other cooperage. If you are a cooper, you will understand what you are looking at. If you are not a cooper, find one. The money is what I had in the house. I have taken what I need for the journey and left the rest here because I have a feeling that whoever finds this will need it more than my sister will. And my sister has a husband and a house and does not lack for much. I have had a feeling about this place for 30 years that it would outlast me and that it would find the person it was meant for. I cannot explain this feeling. I have learned, at 61, not to require explanations for feelings that have not been wrong yet. To whoever you are, the white oak stand is on the hill above the west fence line. There is a spring on the north side of the property that does not freeze. The shaving horse in the south end can be repaired. The arm pivot is cracked, but the mortise is sound and new ash will do. Work the wood from this valley first. It knows the climate. I hope you are warm. I hope the work is good. Eva Mackey, in her own hand, in the cooperage she and Pavo built, on a cold morning in September before the geese went south. Hazel read the letter twice, and then the third time, and on the third reading, something that had been held tightly in her chest since October, since the porch in the flour sack and Reginald Voss's note in his careful merchant's hand. Let go all at once, without warning. She set the letter down on the plank desk and pressed her palms flat against the wood and stood very still for a long time, breathing the smell of the old shavings in the floor and the clean October air through the open window and the particular smell of the cedar walls when the wind moved through them. She did not cry the way people are supposed to cry in moments like this. She cried the way people cry when something they have been carrying alone for too long is finally, unexpectedly, shared, not divided but multiplied, which is the strange arithmetic of being known by someone who cannot know you and knowing them in return. She did not spend the money in a single week. She had never had money, and she understood without being told that the value of it lay not in what it bought in a single afternoon, but in what it sustained over the long work of a season. She went to Oswald Pete's store the next morning and bought cedar shake for the roof, a new handle blank for the bung borer, a pot of linseed oil for the tools, 2 pounds of coffee, and a week's worth of oats and dried beans, and she paid with silver and made a point of paying in full with no account. She mentioned to Oswald that she was a cooper. He set down his pencil. A barrel maker, barrels, buckets, churns, tubs. I can do tight work and slack work. I have my own tools. He was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of quiet that precedes a genuine thought. There's a dairy operation at the McCollin farm about 4 miles east. They use the old wooden churns. Had trouble sourcing repair work since the man in Owen Sound retired. He wrote a name on a piece of paper and put it on the counter. Worth a conversation. The man at the McCallin farm. His name was Walter McCallin, who was 58 and had the permanent squint of a man who had spent 40 years looking into weather, came to the cooperage the following Saturday with a churn that needed a new head and 2 staves replaced along the bilge. He watched her work for 20 minutes without speaking, which was more due diligence than most people managed. Then he said, "What do you charge?" She told him. He nodded. He left the churn and 2 others and said he would be back in 2 weeks. A woman named Dorothea Weck, who ran the chandler's shop in Barrow's Landing with her daughter, appeared at the cooperage 10 days after Hazel had settled in. She brought a pot of soup and a loaf of bread and set them on the workbench without announcement, and said that Oswald Pete had told her there was a young woman alone on the logging road and that she had thought soup was appropriate. She did not wait for thanks, in the way of people who know that thanks is not the point. She came back the following week with her daughter Rosie, who was 14 and interested in everything, and asked if Hazel minded company on Thursday afternoons, which she did not. A man named August Crane, who cut timber on the lots north of the property, came by in November with a load of white oak he'd felled in the clearing of a skid road and asked if she wanted it. He said he had more than he could use and that it was easier to offer it than to drag it to the mill. She paid him a fair price from the silver in the tin box, and he seemed surprised to be paid at all. She repaired the shaving horse exactly as Eva Mecki had said. The pivot arm was cracked at the mortise, new ash, same dimensions, an afternoon's work. She cleaned and oiled the tools that had been left on the wall hooks. The narrow drawknife she identified as a stave finishing blade, a type she hadn't worked with before, and she spent 3 evenings learning its particular tolerances before she trusted it on stock she was getting paid for. She split the white oak on the hill above the west fence line, exactly where Eva's letter had said it would be. She found the stand on a clear morning in late October, about 40 trees at various stages of maturity, healthy and straight-grained, the kind of timber that takes decades to grow, and that Coopers call honest wood because it won't surprise you. She stood among them in the cold and the leaf fall, and thought about a woman named Eva Mecki, who had planted, or tended, or simply recognized those trees, and written their location into a letter to a stranger she would never meet. She used the spring on the north side of the property every day after that. Eva had been right. It ran cold and clear through November and into December, and the water tasted of deep rock and nothing else, which is the best thing water can taste of. The drawings took her longer to understand. She worked through them over the course of several weeks, in the evenings, by candlelight, with the fire low in the stone hearth and the wind off Georgian Bay, moving through the cedars outside and making sounds like something trying to get in. The jig on the third sheet, the one Eva had said she was most proud of, was an apparatus for truing the bilge curve of a barrel head using a radius arm and an adjustable fence, a thing she had seen approximated but never solved as elegantly. She built it from the drawings over the course of 4 evenings, and when she tested it on a practice head and it worked on the first pass, she sat back on her stool and held the radius arm in both hands and thought, she made this, worked it out alone over 30 years, and wrote it down so that someone she would never know could have it. By December, the Cooperage was weather-tight. By January, it was warm. By March, when the snow was still deep in the bush but the maple sap was beginning to move in the trees and the ice on the bay was graying at the edges, Hazel had 3 steady customers, a small account at Oswald Pete's store that she settled on the 1st of every month, a shaving horse that worked perfectly, and a Cooperage that smelled the way it was supposed to smell. White oak and cedar and the particular clean sweetness of a workshop where someone is doing the work they were made to do. Dorothea Weck's daughter Rosie came on Thursdays and sometimes Saturdays and watched everything with the concentrated attention of someone who is learning without meaning to. Hazel showed her how to hold the drawknife on the 4th Thursday, and on the 5th one Rosie produced a shaving that came off the blade in one long unbroken ribbon, and her face did the thing that Hazel's face had done the first time, the involuntary brightness of having understood something physical for the first time through your hands. Hazel said, "There, you felt that?" Rosie said she had. On an evening in early April, when the light lasted later than it had in months, and the first peepers had started up in the low ground by the creek, and the air through the open shop door smelled of cold mud and pine sap, and the first warmth of a year that was finally meaning it, Hazel sat at the shaving horse at the end of the workday, with her father's drawknife across her knees. The fire in the hearth was low, the good low burn of a fire that has been tended all day and knows its work. Eva Mecki's letter was on the shelf above the desk, pinned flat with a stone, beside Hazel's own tools, and beside a small frame she had made from offcuts of white oak, fitted with the piece of paper that had been in the steel box along with the letter, not the drawings. Those were too useful to pin up. But the title transfer she had signed with Oswald Pete, witnessing in Silas Croft's truck on a gray October morning when she had $19 in her pocket and nowhere else to go. She looked at the frame and the letter and the tools on the shelf, and she looked at the floor where the shape of Eva Mecki's shaving horse was still pressed into the earth. And she thought about a woman she had never met who had worked alone in this space for 30 years and had trusted, without evidence, that the right person would find it. She thought about Ing Solberg, who had looked up from a stave blank and said, "You want to watch, or you want to try," and who had handed a drawknife to a 15-year-old girl who didn't know yet what her hands were capable of. She thought about her father, Arvid Fen, who had read almanacs aloud and driven a nail without splitting the wood, and taught her that things worth knowing were worth teaching, and who had been right about that and about most things. She thought about Reginald Voss and his careful note in the merchant's hand, the $2 he had not enclosed, the flour sack on the porch, the figure he had calculated her worth to be, and found insufficient. She found that she could think about him the way you think about weather that has passed, with accuracy and without much feeling, because weather does not require your feelings to be weather, and some men are like that. Outside, the peepers went on. The creek ran loud with snowmelt. Somewhere in the birches, at the edge of the clearing, the first birds were settling in for the night and making the sounds they make when they have found the place where they intend to stay. And Hazel Fen sat in the cooperage that was hers, with the drawknife across her knees and the smell of her knees and the smell of white oak in the air and the work ahead of her in the morning, and the work behind her in the floor and the walls, and she felt what she had not felt since she was a child standing beside father in the mill. The feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, in a place that had been waiting for her before she knew to look for it. We don't usually tell stories about people who have nothing. But sometimes the people who have nothing are the ones who find what was buried for them. And sometimes what was buried is more than silver. What was buried for you, do you think? And have you thought to look?